And I'm calling the business session back into order after conclusion of the executive session. All board members except Gina and Kona are present. And after conclusion of the executive session, there is no activity to report. But we're ready to start the public session now. And we will start with the Pledge of Allegiance. I'll ask Mr. Parker, please, to lead us. Thank you.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. And thank you too to Daniel Maresca from the Tech Department for having that nice video of the flag posted for us. I will do the emergency evacuation proceedings because there's some people in district office. All of you make sure you know where the exit signs are so that in the event of an emergency, you can exit quickly and safely, and no smoking because it's a smoke-free campus. Okay, we have since it's a workshop meeting, we have an abbreviated agenda, but Dr. Gianni, is there any report that you want to make?
Yeah, I got a couple, but I'll be real quick if you don't mind.
Okay.
As part of Women's History Month, that's March, New York State Senator Alexis Week recognized South Country's own Lynette Murphy, who in addition to her social worker role here in the district is also Compass Unity's Coalition's project coordinator. Lynette was recognized for her endless work and dedication to Compass Unity Coalition and the South Country community. So a special thank you out to the Senator and a big congratulations out to Miss Murphy for this well-deserved honor. And then I have some COVID numbers I'd like to report for the community's information. As of yesterday, we have 100 faculty or staff and 277 student total COVID-19 positive cases reported to the district. Now, I again reiterate, that is not current. That is total reported to the district. That is not what is currently occurring. And when it comes to quarantine numbers, as of yesterday, we currently have 0 faculty or staff and 5 students in quarantine as a result of close contact. And that is all the reporting that I have, Ms. Hayes.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Did any trustees have advisory committee reports? Ms. Felice. Okay.
Thank you very much, Madam President, and to the board. With respect to the board's majority vote, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. With respect to the board's majority vote to move from 4 days a week of classroom time to 5 days a week for K through 5, I felt it was important, even though I was cautious of moving in that direction because of the quarantine numbers. I'm happy to hear the report that Dr. Gianni just gave us. But nevertheless, I did not vote in favor of the move. Nevertheless, I felt it was important to support the district and the board in their decision. And so I also felt it was important to be there today for the first Wednesday that we were returning back to 5 days a week. And so I visited every school, K through 5. To witness the reopening of Wednesdays. I was delighted that Vice President Trent joined me on that visit, and I have to say the overwhelming report and support from the students was very much in favor of returning back to school 5 days. They were delighted. They were elated. You could see the smiles through their masks. We started out early this morning at Frank P. Long, and I do want to give a shout out to Principal Brzezinski and AP Oberg, because we arrived there right at bus time. So it was a little chaotic for them, and I do apologize if that's when we arrived, but we told them, please don't worry that we're here. Go do what you have to do. We'll wait for you. But it was very busy, but very, very well organized. And we went around every single hallway in every single building, from Frank P. Long to Brookhaven Elementary, to the Early Childhood Development Center, then to Kramer, and we finished up at Critz. And everybody was very accommodating, very helpful in helping us understand some of the challenges they are meeting in the classroom. We were able to observe the desk partitions that have become cumbersome and why the board approved voting and paying for new ones. It was a challenge to look around them. You know, last week in this community, we lost a community member, Joe Gianni. Joe, I'm sorry, not Joe Gianni. Joe, I'm sorry for that, Dr. Gianni. Joe Giuliani and Gagliano, Joe Gagliano. And he reached out to me. He lived in the community. He was a former superintendent. He reached out to me when I first was elected to the school board. And he said that sometimes being on the school board is a thankless job, but whenever you feel that way, go visit a kindergarten classroom. And I thought of him today in his passing, and I just want to give a shout out to Mr. Briggs, who was a very good friend of him, and extend my condolences to him on his passing. But he was on my mind in making this decision to go visit K-5 on today. And I'm so glad I did, because the little ones have adapted, and it's something that the principals have said. They're so resilient to the challenges in the classroom, and I'm sure Ms. Aruda understands this perfectly with in her teaching capacity. The students adapt, and they are accommodating to whatever's before them. But we had so many children tell us how much they love school, how much they wanted to be in school, and I was particularly moved by one of our teachers at Kramer, Mrs. Volk, who had the children explain to us that being there 5 days a week enables them to do science projects that they weren't able to do with that break in between, and they can monitor their science project for all 5 days while they're in the classroom. We were also told that kindergartners went to the library for the very first time today. So it was a very rewarding experience. We got to witness children in music. There's no music classes at this point, but there's music lessons. So we were treated to an accompaniment with piano and saxophone, which we also thoroughly enjoyed. And I just can't speak enough, and I should stop talking now so that Mr. Trent can share his thoughts. But it was just a very rewarding experience and proof why it's so important for board members to visit the schools when we can. And I really did make the decision to retire when I did, being on the school board, to have more time to make visits like this. And I stayed away from the classrooms and the schools because of the virus. I didn't want to be a contributing factor, God forbid. But now that I'm fully vaccinated and past the period that I should be safer, and I felt I was safer for the students and faculty and staff, I returned to the classrooms today, and it was an extremely rewarding experience. I asked about the markers on the floor, who actually placed them there. In some schools it was teachers, a combination of teachers. In some schools it was custodian. In other schools it was the gym teacher. We witnessed gym outside at Kramer. The kids were laughing and jumping and yelling and banging and doing all the things they could be doing. There were young girls on the monkey bar. I could never do the monkey bar as a kid. And I was so impressed with these kids and what they were able to do. And it was just a completely rewarding experience. So I just want to share that with the board, that I was happy to be there on your behalf to witness this and bring this back to you, because that decision, I know, we really labored with that decision. And I want, I just want to compliment the board for sticking together and honoring a difference of opinion for just out of caution for our students, faculty, and staff. But it was really a rewarding experience. The buildings were pristine. The renovated library at Frank P. Long was a compliment, a perfect compliment to the wonderful courtyard that we have at Frank P. And everybody was just so proud. They're just so proud of the work they're doing. We thank them for the extra work that they are putting in, and I thank the parents for just having the patience with us to have a dialogue and even have a difference of opinion, just to make sure that we get it right. So again, it was a very rewarding day, and I'm glad that I was able to do it.
Any other reports before we take our main reason for being here tonight, which is our budget presentation? Mr. Trent, is that your hand up?
Yes, I just wanted to echo Ms. Felice. The experience today was a great one. Just seeing the students' expression of them being back on Wednesdays is priceless. They were all happy, excited to be there. But I just wanted to just echo the importance of board members going to the buildings and seeing things firsthand. Just a quick example, the partitions, how we had an example of one in the boardroom, and it's so different seeing it in the boardroom versus in action, in front of the students, on their desks, So things like that, you get a different perspective when you're in the classroom or you're walking the halls, So I think it's incredibly important for board members, when they can and when they are able to, definitely visit the schools when they can. That's all I have.
Okay, I think we're ready to move on to our budget presentation.
Yes, thank you. Our one item for discussion this evening is our sixth in a series of budget presentations. It is an expense and revenue review, along with the administration's proposed budget plan recommendation for the board. As I communicated to the board last night, a state budget agreement was reached late yesterday, and projected school aid runs were made available last night. Today, administration took a closer look at school aid runs and made adjustments to our budget presentation and administration's recommendation based on the additional funding that we are receiving from the state. Ms. Costa will present our budget proposal for the board's consideration, followed by a discussion with the board and hopefully direction for the board on moving forward with a budget adoption plan. So I'll turn it over to Ms. Costa.
Thank you, Dr. Gianni, and thank you, board members. Are we seeing the front page of the slides? Great. Well, welcome everybody. This is our sixth budget presentation during our budget development season. And tonight we will go over the expense and revenue update. And just to add to all the interesting things that have happened this year, this is one of the first years in many that the state budget has been delayed. And then that has put us in a position where literally late last night we received the runs and we were making changes to our plans. So here we are. Here's our expense and revenue update. Here's our budget development calendar. And in between our last meeting and today, we were required to do our first publication of our legal notice. That has happened. It is published 4 times in both the Long Island Advance and the South Shore Press. Those are the dates of the publications of the legal notice, just for everybody's edification. And now here we are tonight. Tonight we are at an update of our budget and revenue. Historically, this is when we have state aid information. And in a pandemic year, we have not just state aid information, we have lots of new information to share with the board tonight. So tonight we will go over updated state aid information, which is traditional, and this is non-traditional. We will discuss the CRISA and the rescue federal grant monies that are identified in our state aid runs, and we have allocations for that. We will do an update of expenditures, and we will discuss use of reserves and fund balance. So here we are tonight. What will we cover? These are the areas that we're looking to cover tonight. We're going to go back to our very first budget presentation, and we're going to review fund balance information, and we're actually going to take it forward with some information that some board members had asked for at the last meeting. So we're going to take fund balance information forward, discuss reserves, talk about that which we know in the state aid runs, the new federal aid dollars, which are known as CRISA and rescue, and we're going to update our budget gap. We're going to, for the first time, take a multi-year outlook of where we are, not just in 21, 22, but beyond. And we're going to look at our options and moving forward in this budget development season. So again, this is what it's all about. As we build a budget, we're looking for a triangle that's well balanced. This year, the conversation has all been around revenues, and will continue to be as long as we have revenues that are not keeping in pace with our expenditures. To balance to our educational program, we will continue to have challenges into the oncoming years. So let's go back to the very first meeting where we met. And I think that meeting was back in January. So we're going to go back, and we spoke about our financial position and our fund balance. So this is a good time to revisit that conversation. And so what we did here was, each of these columns are labeled so we can speak about them. Column A is our reserves, our audited reserves as of our last audit statement. And that was June 30th, 2020. That was our audited reserves and fund balance. It was $28.7 million. And then when we built the budget that we're in right now, the 2021 school year, we, as you know, the board authorized the use of $5.5 million of reserves and fund balance, and that's represented in column B. And then as we move forward with column C, D, and E, we're going to speak about them, but these are really projections and estimates that we're going to speak about. So in column C, this is an estimate of where we might be able to fund our reserves at the end of this year. Of all years, this has been most unusual. We have lots of expenditures we didn't plan for. We have even some things that we planned for that didn't occur. And we also still have things hanging out there from the state on some aid that may not or may be forthcoming. So this estimated funding of $5.6 million in column C is very, very preliminary. But we need to estimate something to bring us forward to column D, which is where we think we might be at the end of this school year. So at the end of this school year, column D is where we think we might be. And at our conclusion of our last meeting, one of the board trustees asked, what was the maximum that we could use? And so column E actually represents the maximum we could use. And I use the word could because could isn't really maybe what we recommend. And the reserves that are on the top, the workers' comp, the unemployment, the retirement systems, EBLAR, capital, and repair, those are actually reserves, and those are segregated for specific purposes. So when you see an amount in there, like the workers' comp reserve, the first line for $1 million, it doesn't equal the $3 million next to it in column D, and that is because you can only use a reserve up to the expenditures that you would spend in a year. So in a given year, our workers' comp expenditures are approximately $1 million. Even that number is not locked in because we may spend a little more or a little less, but we can use the reserve up to the level of our expenditure. And that's true for all the reserves as we move down the page. So unemployment, we know how fluid that has been through this whole year and all the federal government involved in extending unemployment. If we had $200,000 in expenditures next year, which is what is in our budget next year, we could use $200,000 of the reserve. And the retirement system, this is the local employees. This is for our classified employees, ERS. We have our expenses about $1.5 million a year. We could use $1.5 million. Retirement system, while our expense for the teachers' retirement system, TRS, is well greater than $1.7 million, if you see next to it, we only have 1.7 million. So we could use it all because our expense far exceeds that reserve. And our EBLA reserve, which is Employee Benefit Accrued Liability Reserve, that's to pay out employees' time when they leave the district, when they usually, it's when you retire from the district. Our average expenses for the last couple of years have run in the $1.2 million range. So that answers the question of what we could use. And then if you get down to the very last line, our unassigned fund balance, doesn't have any restrictions on it. That is the line item that is by law restricted to 4% of our next year's budget. But the question was, what could we use? What's the maximum we can use? And nothing prevents you from using the whole entire $9.8 million. So there is the summary of all our reserves and our fund balance and what we could use. And you see a line in blue at the bottom called debt service, because that's actually not part of the general fund. That's actually part of the debt service fund. It's a different functional fund for the district. And we have been on a plan for a couple of years. There has been built up fund balance in that fund. And this will be the last year in 21-22 of money in that fund. So that $574,000 at the bottom of the page, that is the last of the monies in the debt service fund. So that comes to a maximum estimated available use of close to $16 million, $15.9 million. Then we're going to go to the next slide, and we're going to take this conversation and a couple of these columns forward from here. So here is the same column D and E that was on the last slide taken forward. And then column F represents what we would recommend we would use in the district, which isn't the $16 million, which is the maximum. It is a recommended use. And we'll talk about that further as we move through the budget conversations today. And there's an arrow down below of the unassigned to the assigned fund balance. And what that represents is once you decide, and the board has decided in the last couple of years to appropriate $4 million of fund balance, it moves out of the $9.8 million unassigned into an assigned line item. That's actually just an accounting technicality. It literally moves there because it's spoken for, and it would come out of that $9.8 million balance. So that is just a summary of our very first meeting, and we'll take that forward as we continue to talk tonight. Okay, so we're still going over where we were before we have new state aid information. So this is a summary for all of us. This is a summary of our last meeting. And as we had spoke about at our governor's run, we knew that our state aid was actually down 2% from our prior year. And that was contributing to our $14.9 million gap. So this is a summary of where we were at our last meeting. And the question continues to come up of what makes up that gap. And I thought it was worthwhile for us to go over it yet again. The gap is made up of three components. We know our expenditures increased by 5%, which is $7 million. And those increases need to be supported by revenues. But unfortunately, our revenues declined this year to the tune of almost 2%. And that again is something we would have to financially cover because we don't have revenues to support not only the $7 million, but we'd have to find a way to support the $2 million that we lost. And as at this point in time at our last meeting, we had yet to make a decision on reserves and what to use or not use. So that is really, in theory, if we had no reserves, it would be a loss of $5.5 million. In reality, we just haven't made a decision on that yet. And if you add those numbers down, it's the same $14.9 million on the other representation, just a way to look at it differently. And that is the $14.9 million gap in summary. So at our last meeting, we talked about where we started the process off in January. We started at a $16.8 million gap, and what we have done to get to the $14.9 million gap. So at this point, as of our last meeting, we reduced our gap by $1.9 million. And we talked about the three columns on this closing the gap slide. The three columns, the three things that change a gap for any school district is fund balance and use of reserves, and revenue and expenditure changes. So it's columns A, B, and C. Those are the three direct impacts to a gap. And fund balance and reserves is a one-shot solution. and changes to your revenue and your expenditures are more permanent solutions to any financial situation. So here we are, we're caught up of where we have been for the last 5 meetings. So now let's talk about new information that's come out since this meeting. So late last night, we received state aid run for the district, and we began to dissect that. The item being most spoke about on the state aid runs is the identification down here of federal aid. There are 2 federal aid components, the CRISA and the rescue monies. The CRISA stands for Coronavirus Relief and Recovery Supplemental Act. And the rescue funds are, that's being the term used for the most recent legislation passed. The CRISA was enacted in December 2020. And the rescue was enacted in March 2021. And you haven't heard a lot about the CRISA because we were actually, it mirrored the CARES Act funding, and we had heard initially that it might be a supplanting instead of a supplementing. So there hadn't been a lot of talk about it, and everybody was talking about rescue. And you'll see as we move through the presentation, as it's turned out, it is not a supplanting, it is a supplementing, and that is very happy news for us today. So now we're going to unpack what we know. We use this slide to present, but now the orange column, the highlighted in orange and green, represent new information that we had. So let's unpack it a little at a time. Let's first look at this year, 2021. And that's what's just identified in red here, these bars. We originally built a budget. The first column was our 2021 budget. It balanced $138 million in revenues, $138 million in expenditures. We had the pandemic, and we got the governor's proposal in January, and the second column was represented. We noticed that there was going to be a gap in state aid. We expected some form of a gap because of transportation and other expenses that we did not incur. So those are expense-based aids that we did not incur the expense, so we will not get the aid. We expected to see a decline here, and we've known about this since January. But when we got the run, it initially looked like that gap that had developed in January had widened by approximately another $1 million, that we would have a budget for the year we're sitting in this year that we would not recognize revenue to the tune of almost $3 million, $2.9 million. But late this afternoon, I got a call. I had a call into one of the state planning units that we subscribe to, asking. I needed to know the answer here to say what was going to happen here. And I got confirmation from them that while the change from the governor's proposal to the legislative proposal is a $1,017,000 change, it's really going to be covered by CARES Act money. When the governor presented his proposal in January, you might recall, he was combining a lot of things. He was combining CARES Act. He was doing pandemic adjustments. He was doing STAR adjustments. It was very confusing to unpack his proposal. Well, the legislature decided to go back to the standard way that we have seen school aid runs for a long time. And in doing that, they don't show the CARES Act because it's going to be a federal grant and it's going to be money that we receive from the federal government. So while it looks like the gap might have widened, it really did not. It just looks different to us. So that is just information for the board in case they unpacked the state aid runs themselves and it looked like we were out $1 million. We really are not. So now we move to 21-22. So here we have, with this green bar, we have the governor's proposal, which had state aid of $56.7 million for us. And now we're seeing $58.4 million. That is a change of $1.6 million to the district. So we are seeing that change. But as we continue to, and that change down below, you'll see the $14.9 million gap that we keep speaking about. That change will directly impact our gap. And we'll see that as we continue to move through the slides. It is a direct impact. We got more revenue, so it will close the gap. But the interesting piece is we have to continue to have this conversation, which is the purple line, is that our revenue that we are getting has to be compared to what we built last year's budget on. So last year, we built our budget, that's the purple line, at $58 million. And now we are at $58.4 million. And here is the change with this purple arrow in the top left-hand corner. We really are only receiving additional aid of $392,000. You'll remember in each of our slides, our state aid was down 2%. Well, now it's up, but it's only up 0.68% for the year. So we still have revenue not increasing or at pace with the 5% increase in our expenditures. So down below, the two lines right here are our total revenues. And while our gap is closing, our total revenues for the year are still down about 0.5%, and our expenditures are still increased 5%. And we'll continue to talk about that, not just now, but as we move into the future. So that's the state aid unpacking of the state aid run that we got last night. Let's move forward to the federal aid and what we know about the two new federal aids that we're receiving. The CRISA funds, known as the Coronavirus Relief and Recovery Supplemental Act, passed in December 2020 at the end of President Trump's term when he was in office. The allocation, which we didn't hear anything about, is on the runs $3.9 million. What we do know, we don't know a lot, but we know the following: that it was enacted in December 2020. Final instructions are pending. We're going to recommend use over 3 years. Preliminary guidance that we were able to get today is it's going to act similar to the CARES Act funding that we already have, and that was application-based. We had to fill out a full grant application to receive those funds, and actually recently our grant application for CARES was approved. So it's going to be a similar application. The uses initially seem to be similar to CARES. We're waiting for final guidance. And the one thing that is different from the CARES Act to this CRISA funds is that the CARES Act we had to share with private and parochial schools. We do not have to do this with CRISA funds. So that's one thing that has been confirmed. So the $3.9 million should be $3.9 million for our district. So that is the first federal bucket of money that we've received notice of. And then we have the rescue funds. Our allocation, we originally thought it might be 7.1 million. We had gotten distribution of that number. The newspaper had 6.8 million. Well, the final number has come in at $9 million. So that again is a relief news. And here's what we know. It was enacted in March of 2021. Final instructions are pending, and we will recommend use over 3 years. Robert Schneider, who's the executive director at NISBA, sent out some correspondence recently on possible rescue fund uses. And this is what he had published in what he wrote. It is not final guidance, but I think people have been asking, what could we use these funds for? And this is some of the examples of some of the uses of those funds. So we have looked at that, and we are waiting for final guidance. So now we're going to move forward in our gap sheet that we're used to seeing. This is our closing the gap sheet. Everything down in blue, we saw purple and green was where we were as of our last meeting. That was our gap was $14.9 million. Right here was our gap. Right here was our gap at our last meeting. And now we are moving forward. And this is this is the closing the gap recommendation. It'd be to use CRISA funds for $1.4 million, rescue grant fund use of $4.5 million, $7.3 million in reserves and appropriated fund balance. We have additional revenue from the latest state aid run of $1.6 million. And just to balance everything out, there's a $529 that we would have to balance out, and we would balance that out in our benefit codes. That would leave a gap for the district of 0. We will have closed the gap. And it's important because these 3 columns on this sheet labeled E, D, and A that are actually boxed off in red. They're the CRISA, the rescue, and the fund balance, those 3 columns. It's important for us to note, though, that there's a lot of activity on the left side of this page, and all 3 of those columns are one-shot revenue sources for the district. And columns B and C are where changes would need to be that are more permanent in nature. And because we're dealing with revenue sources that are temporary in nature, it's important for us to look into the future and what some of those effects. It's difficult to look into the future because there are a lot of moving parts, but it's important, I think, for us as a community and a school district to look into the future. So while here we are looking at 21-22 in a zero gap, here is what a future would look like at 22-23 school year when we would start the following year's budget. The estimated gap would be $13.7 million. And there are some assumptions you have to make when you do this, but leaves us to a talking points to know that we would have the second year of CRISA funding would be used at the tune of $1.5 million. We would use $300,000 of rescue fund money. We would be using $6.5 million right here of reserves and appropriating fund balance, a little less than the prior year. You'll see the change here. And we need to use less because those funds will not be available all the time. They're one-shot revenues, just like CRISA and rescue funds are. And we would still be looking at a gap in 22, a possible gap of about $1.4 million in 22-23. And then let's go forward again. This would be the third year of our CRISA and rescue funding. We would use the last $1 million of CRISA. We'd use the last $1.4 million in rescue. We would use $6 million of reserves and fund balance. And we would still be looking at a possible gap of $1.6 million when we build our 23-24 budget. And then the next year, which is very important to look at, is our 24-25 year. This would be the year where we would not have any CRISA or rescue funds. So the funds will have been spent, and we would be, we would still be looking at a $1.8 million possible gap when we started to build this budget. Now, a lot of things can change. This assumes certain levy increases. It assumes certain state aid. It assumes certain growth in expenditures. And as we know, many of those can change. Like we assuming 3% growth in expenditures, we see this year the growth in expenditures is 5%. Some years, health insurance and retirement system growth is very high. And we can't predict all the out years, but for conversation purposes, I think it's important for us to see that this year, how it impacts and how our impact will go into future years as a district. Because as we go back to our triangle, which is the grounding our conversations, as our revenues not increasing at the same pace of our expenditures will be a problem that we have to visit each year as we move forward. So now let's take this forward to our tax levy. Here's a slide of our tax levy at the limit, at a 5% increase, and at a 10% increase. So the blue column is at the levy limit. The yellow column is at a 5% override for this year, and the green column would be at a 10% levy override for this year. So I'll take you through the highlights. At the very bottom of the page, it says annual and monthly. So in the annual box at the bottom of the page, if we go forward with our tax levy limit, the average assessed homeowner in the South Country School District will see a $61.63 increase in their school taxes at the limit. If we were to move forward with the 5% levy increase, the average homeowner would have a $246 increase, annual increase to their school taxes. And if we went forward with a 10% levy, it would be $499 increase to the average assessed homeowner in the South Country School District. But I wanted to point something out to everyone so they just can see. Up here, the box that I have us boxing off in red, at each of those overrides, you see that our revenues are growing at less than 1% if we stay at the limit. If we went for a 5% override, it still is only growing at 2.54%. And if we went for a 10% override, our revenues would be growing at 5.46. The line right underneath that shows the growth in our budget at 5.15%. At some time in the future, as we use our one-shot revenues, these have to align more closely, or we will, this will be a gap that we will be discussing for years to come, because the growth in revenue is just not matching the growth in expenditures. And there's a line up here. There's a line right here that shows the CRISA and rescue funding. This is one-shot deals, and that's part of the reason why we're able to close the gap for revenues that are not keeping pace with our expenditures. So now that we've gone through some of those details, we're going to come back to the very first slide that we spoke about. This was the slide that shows that we have closed the gap for the 21-22 school year. It's the same slide, and it now says recommendation for closing the gap, because this is the recommendation over 3 years. This is our recommendation for the one-time federal funding of CRISA and Rescue and the use of that money. And it would be to close the gap this year. And the blue box is really representative of all of the numbers in how we would close that gap. We spoke about we'd use 1.4 of CRISA, 4.5 million of rescue, 7.3 million in fund balance and reserves. And we did get additional state aid of 1.6 million, and we have to just do a minor adjustment for $529. That closes the gap. I'm going to take the same information on the next slide. I'm going to just show it to you in a different format, because we were closing, here is our last meeting. We're closing this $14.9 million gap. And I'm sorry, I went a little fast. We're closing this $14.9 million gap with everything that's happened in here in blue. And this is just, this next slide is another way to look at the same information. We are using rescue funds to 4.5 million. CRISA funds for 1.4, and we did get actual state aid. This is the only permanent revenue increase that we've received to close that gap for 1.6 million. So that is additional revenues of 7.6 million. And we would be appropriating $7.3 million in reserves and fund balance. And those together would close the gap of the 14.9 million. So what is this, what does this recommended budget educationally represents? Well, it represents that, the budget is program driven. Any staff reductions that we've spoke about in prior meetings were the result of declining enrollment. All of our programs remain. And our class size guidelines and our average class sizes are still within our class size guidelines of 25, and they've been preserved. We've had no change in our fine and performing arts programs or our interscholastic athletic programs. We continue to support our K-12 intervention programs. We provide expanded support for our K-5 in summer programming due to the pandemic and anticipated loss of learning. And it also provides for 5 contingent positions as we move forward and out of the pandemic. So what are our next steps? Our next steps are determinations and decisions. It's determinations and approvals. The first is to determine the CRISA funding use for 21-22, 22-23, and 23-24, approving a multi-year planned use of that $3.9 million. And in those slides that we had earlier that showed the out years, this was what was represented on those slides: a use of $1.4 million next year, $1.5 million in 22-23, and the remainder $1 million used in 23-24 when we build that budget. And then for the rescue funding, the same thing. We will need to determine the use for 21-22, 22-23, 23-24. Again, we're asking to approve a multi-year planned use of that $9 million, $4.5 million being used in 21-22, $3 million in 22-23, and the remainder, $1.4 million used in the 23-24 school year. And then we're going to determine the use of our reserves and fund balance. The recommendation would be to approve the use of the following reserves and fund balance for next school year. In those amounts, for $7.3 million, they represent an increase over the $5.5 million in the prior year, but that is what we're looking for in the recommendation. And that is our recommended plan for next year and ongoing. These are the meetings we've met through tonight. Our next scheduled meeting is our budget adoption in April 21st. May 5th, we will have a budget hearing, and we all know this culminates in our budget vote and our trustee election on May 18th. So that is the presentation for tonight.
May I ask some questions?
Yes,
Sure.
absolutely.
Okay.
Can
I-
we, can I ask, do you need the presentation up, or can we close it so everyone could see everyone?
In order to ask my questions, I don't need it because I use the last century method of printing it out on a paper.
So we can go back and forth. So
Okay.
So you want to get out right now?
yeah, why don't you get out for now?
Okay.
Okay, and Ms. Costa, I'm actually gonna start in reverse order from the back of your presentation. Um, and just to say, in looking at the entire thing, it looks like you, administration was able to maintain our capital reserve fund without having to get taxpayer approval to turn that over to operating expenses. Is that right?
Yeah, so you saw the previous presentation, obviously, and absent the new money that we had and not wanting to dip into reserves any further, we were planning to recommend to ask the taxpayer to utilize that as a funding source. Given the new money, we prefer leaving it there to provide for capital work because our buildings do need capital work.
And because the taxpayers had approved that and
Correct.
had indicated they wanted to have a capital reserve fund. So I'm glad to see that we've maintained that. I have a couple of questions about using the different reserve funds, like EBLAR, TRS, ERS, workers' comp, unemployment reserve. That will leave enough on deposit so that we're adequately covered, so that all of the possible claims against those funds could be made. Is that right?
If I understand your question, that is a recommendation to use those reserves as a revenue source to support the corresponding expenditures that would happen in those areas. I think am I answering your question correctly?
Okay, so basically it's not taking money out of those reserve funds, but rather saying these will be made available to cover any of the pension claims that are made or the workers' comp claims that will be made during the upcoming year.
Well, it is taking them out of the reserves. So it is taking them out of the reserves. And just so we're all aware that at the levels that we're taking them out, we will not be able to fully replenish our reserves, as has been financially the situation we have been in the past. We've been able to use reserves, see how the year played out, and replenish them. We will be able to replenish some of our reserves, but not all of our reserves.
Okay, and so at this time next year, would any of those funds be available to be applied toward expenses for the following year?
Yes, when I did the out year slides that brought us past 21, 22 into the years further past that, it included using those reserves. If you'll see, the recommendation is 7.3 million, and each year the recommendation would be to move down from there a little bit, because we need to get to a level where we're using them and replenishing them. Because if you're using them and not replenishing them, they will be gone, and then you'll really have the cliff, and you will have to deal with that cliff. So we're recommending that we use a little more than we can replenish given the situation, and then to right size the ship as we go forward in the future years.
Okay, so you're looking into the future also about how to rein in some expenses, because if our expenses are going up around 5% a year, and most of them are contractual related, both for staffing and for like transportation, for example. Your plan then would enable us to meet those increases as long as we carefully look at our need for staffing in the era of a declining student enrollment.
Yes, the possible gaps that were shown in the after 21, 22, when we get to 22, 23, and those 3 years after that, there still were possible gaps in all 3 of those years that we indicated as a possible gap. We don't know what attrition would look like. We don't know what all the sources of revenue and increases would look like. It's really just an indication to show that the outpacing of expenditures to revenues is real and ongoing. It's real and ongoing. We will have to address that, not just this year, in each of the years. So we will have to get that, they call that an operational deficit when your recurring revenues, not your one-shot deals, your recurring revenues, that would be for us, state aid and your tax levy in our type of business. Those are our two recurring. When those equal your expenditures, you're no longer in an operational deficit. You are meeting all your needs by things that recur each and every year. And that is the goal in any organization that operates, is to have recurring revenues support recurring expenditures, because otherwise you have to have, you don't want to deal with any funding cliffs. Those are always difficult. But we will have to address what seems to be perceived gaps in the foreseeable future.
So while the recommendation right now, I'm delighted at the ability of you being able to make the recommendation, given the extreme circumstances that everybody's lived through for the past year. But it does make me think that we are using our one-shot source of funding, and after the 3 years, none of that'll be left. And the only other way to close the gaps, say 3 or 4 years from now, would either be because our expenses go down enough, or at that point, talking about piercing a tax cap. Am I missing something in saying that?
Yes, absent any, let's say we had no staff attrition next year, none, zero, just theoretically, we would have a gap, and we would have to address that. Either we raise revenues or we decrease expenditures. Those are the only ways to close a gap.
Okay. All right. Now, as far as in the recommended budget, I am delighted to see the language in there about expanded support for a K-5 summer programming because of the pandemic, quote unquote, loss of learning, but in order to provide some really good enrichment experience for our kids. So there's money in this budget to permit that?
Yes.
And what about transportation for that?
We historically have not provided transportation to the summer programs.
And I actually see that as a virtual program, Ms. Hayes, because we had pretty good success with the virtual program this past summer. And to encourage families to utilize the program, even when maybe they may be away from home, kids could still log on to the program.
Okay. All right, thanks for explaining that.
And we are investigating how we might be able to provide additional support for our secondary students as well. As you all know, secondary is a different animal with courses, but we are exploring that as well.
Okay. And I guess my other concern has to do with, again, looking down the road at other very significant expenses, particularly capital expenses like for new roofs or science lab renovations and upgrades. And my understanding is that those items have generally been paid for through bonding. And where do we stand on the existing bonds? Is there some point at which we'll no longer have to be paying for those?
Yes, that is, the bonds are paid off in a certain scheduled format. I happened to just pull up while you were speaking, just so that I would have some information. We will see minor declines of not much, $100,000 in 22-23 of our payment obligations on our debt service, $200,000 the year after that. But when we all go all the way forward to 27-28 school year, we will have a $2.7 million roll off of debt in that year. Usually they say to plan for a bond issue, it's about a 2-year planning process, what the needs are, how large it should be. Then there has to be community involvement, and it's a process. So probably about 2 years before 27, 28 would be a smart time for us to think about it, because we have a significant roll off of debt, which would really have no impact to the budget and or the levy for us to do work if we married rolling off with rolling on. And we would probably need a vote the year before that so we could marry the debt payments coming off and coming on exactly. So it would be the least impact to our community.
And in the meantime, we have money in our budget to keep maintaining the structures that we have. But in the event that a bigger repair was necessary, we do have the capital reserve fund that we can use.
That is correct.
Yes, by voter approval.
Right. And that to me was a very critical issue, because they're the ones who said they wanted us to have that and have it available for that purpose. And I was not comfortable from our last meeting at the idea that a question might be raised about whether to apply it to operating expenses. I was not comfortable with that. I'm glad that this has worked out, so we don't have to do that. Okay. For now, I'm going to yield. I've asked my questions. Any other questions? Any other board member? Do we have, do you need any guidance from us, or the fact that you've come in with like,
I think you do see a hand now. Mr. Ruda raised her hand.
okay, all right.
All right, I was going from page to page. And I appreciate all the hard work that was put into this. I do understand that last night's rollout was late, and I'm sure it was a very long day for you, Ms. Costa. So thank you for putting that in. One of my major concerns, and I did vocalize this during exec session, our last one, was our staff cuts. I do know that we are having a declining enrollment. However, I also know that the past year and a half that we have been through has really impacted our students and their academic success. My question would be, in terms of this budget right now, I know that our class sizes are about 25. With the monies that were put in and were rolled out last night, can we use this for staffing so that we can even decrease our class size even more to meet the needs of our students? Nothing in a budget beats person to student interactions and how our students improve that way.
Well, if you take monies that we're using to hiring staff or bringing or not accessing staff, then you need to find those monies somewhere else.
Right. So that would
and
be my
just to clarify, the projections have our class sizes at a range of 17 to 24. They're still not at guideline. Our sizes have been unusually low for a couple of years, and this budget has addressed that and brought them still under guideline. Could you use funds to hire staff? I suppose you could, but then you would need to find those funds to cut somewhere else. I think we all know that, unfortunately, staffing is about 75% of the budget. So you're not going to get those funds from supplies or equipment or things like that.
No, I'm aware. And with the monies that were brought in, I know that it is a 3-year rollout. I don't know if those monies could be utilized for staffing. And again, knowing that our students, all students across the board, really have been impacted by what has happened this past year and a half, whether we are lower or, and I do know that at Frank P. Long, some of our classrooms are at 24, 25 students, and bringing that down, I really do think beyond the summer program or whatever else really would have the most impact in helping our students to lessen the gap that we've unfortunately been thrown into. So that would be my question is, whether it be, utilizing some of this money, talking maybe some of our retirement incentives. I do understand that that is something that would be contractually, but I'd like to see our money's being used to bodies in the classrooms, because when it comes to education, I do think that that is the most important part of our education system.
Understood, but again, if we do use it for bodies, we have to find it somewhere else. So I'm confident that the class sizes are going to be appropriate for what we need. I think our biggest goal is to get kids back. I mean, having kids back 5 days, that's what's really needed. But again, I think our sizes will be at 17 to 24, pretty much the range that they should be at. We've had some unusually low class sizes. That is the only reason why we are recommending to reduce only 2 sections at the elementary level. It's not a big impact to the class sizes as you may think. I see Mr. Trent's hand.
Yes, so to be clear, you're still recommending what's in green, the staff cuts?
that again, Mr.
What slide are you looking at, Mr. Trent?
Page 9, it's on, and page 14.
I gotta go. I have to dish through that then.
We're recommending, yes, it's page 9.
What's the
I'm sorry.
caption, Mr. Trent?
Closing the gap.
Yes, slide 14 is the same as slide 19. The only difference on slide 19 is we use the word recommendation because we're making it clear that that's our recommendation on slide 19. But it is the same as slide 14.
Now, so when I see elementary staff, it's $268,000. Is that what you recommend? I guess like privatizing the early childhood center?
3 of those are at the early childhood center. Yes.
Okay. So I can't. I'm not sure if I expressed this at the last meeting. I can't support the cut of elementary staff, secondary staff, and the non-instructional staff at this time. I can see, why we want to cut the administrative position. I can support that, but the other 3 at this time, I cannot. So that would leave, since the gap is at 0, if we don't have those 3 cuts, the gap would be $1.8 million. So is there a way where we could find those monies to keep these staff?
No, again, to find the money, you're talking about big money with little places to look.
Okay. So,
As I indicated, staff, unfortunately, is about 75% of your budget. And I do want to just remind the board that when you add staff back, and I'll take you back to Ms. Costa's layout of the next 3-4 years, that expense is just going to compound your gap next year. It's unfortunate, but these staffing reductions due to enrollment are necessary. They really need to happen to be able to balance this budget and future budgets, because it's just going to be, you'll be cutting 40 folks next year or 50, and you won't have the attrition to support it. I get the interest in keeping staff, I really do, and it's not something administration enjoys doing, but it's the only way to balance the budget. And I remind the board that we haven't changed any programming. We haven't bumped up class sizes. If we hadn't gotten the rescue funds, and I know you all looked at the previous recommendation, absent the rescue funds, I was prepared to ask you to pierce the cap because we couldn't find the money anywhere else without devastating program. We were fortunate that rescue funds came in, And we were very fortunate of the size of those funds that we were allowed to spread them over for 3 years. And we really believe that while we are using more reserves now to balance this budget and close that gap, we want to decrease that because we want to keep our reserves healthy and funded. And by increasing expenses is not the way to do that.
So are you recommending at all that we touch the cap?
I'm sorry, Mr. Trent, I didn't hear you. Say it
Are
again.
you recommending that we pierce the cap?
Am I? I'm not making that recommendation. No, I believe we have a balanced budget with what we presented this evening. That's something the board would have. Listen, what you see before you is administration's recommendation. Obviously, the board needs to support it or give administration further direction on what they would like to say.
Yeah, but it's just, I'm asking that question because it's just not clear. What is, when I'm looking at page 18, there's the limit, there's the 5%, then there's a 10%. So when you talked about the 3 years and from now, you want your revenues to equal your expenditures. But the only way that, from what I heard, to do that down the road is to increase the taxes, or you make those massive cuts. Am I correct?
No, you're accurate. So if you were to pierce the cap and you were successful in passing the budget, you would have closed an expense problem that you have. However, let me share with you my view. I don't see any district looking to pierce a cap this year, given the rescue funds that are being dealt out to districts. I don't want to be the only district on Long Island piercing the cap after I got all this money. I don't think it'll be supported by our community. I think we have a good plan in place. We project out what the possible gap may be moving forward. I believe it's very possible we could handle that gap through attrition and efficiencies and hopefully an increase in revenues. And if you can't at that time, then that's the time to look at piercing the cap. Right now, in my view, it is not the time to look at piercing the cap.
So now, from these projections on page 18, it's a 5% and then a 10% tax increase. So, like, what are you thinking we may have? Like, if we don't get any extra one shocks next year, the year after that, what kind of tax increases would you possibly be considering?
Yeah, so again, the real reason why that slide remained is because it was presented in the initial presentation when I felt that was our only out. I don't believe it's our only out now. So I don't believe it's something you want to move forward. I left it in there so the board could see the effect if they did choose to move in that direction.
I wanted to see that in particular, Mr. Trent, thinking forward into the years to come, because until we've got a definite revenue stream that's going to cover our basic operating expenses, we're just going to have this gap problem come up every year.
Yeah.
And given the projections that are in here, not the budget that we're talking about right now, but the following year, the 22-23 year, is a projected gap of 1.4 million. The year after that, 1.6 million. The year after that, 1.8. And I can see the progression that it's widening. So one reason to pierce the cap, if the taxpayers approved it, is because that would give us a revenue stream that would be locked in and we would know we'd have that available. But based on Dr. Gianni's recommendation, and I do not disagree with him, this is not the year that anybody wants to be proposing a piercing of the cap unless we have to. And of course, in the future, my hope is that the star deduction on the federal income tax level will be reinstated, which would be helpful to people on Long Island and perhaps would make piercing the cap less onerous. And while we're on the topic of piercing the cap, just to clarify, Ms. Costa, what you had said to me yesterday, that piercing the cap now no longer causes loss of any STAR benefits to anybody because the STAR program no longer has that penalty in it.
The property tax rebate program, which was different than the traditional STAR program that we all know of, there was a secondary property tax relief. They tied it to districts staying within the cap, and then homeowners in the fall, right before the November elections, got a check in the mail. That sunsetted in 2019, and has not been renewed.
And that has nothing to do with the pandemic or the CARES money or anything else. That's a separate issue. So the concern about piercing the cap would not include a concern about causing a subsequent problem for the taxpayer, because the law itself has cut out on that rebate.
Correct.
Correct. Okay, so, but anytime you try to pierce the cap, we have to get 60% or better approval rate. And not to beat a dead horse, but what a terrible year to try to do that to anybody. And now that we've come up with a plan that allows us to go another year while still maintaining reserves so that we're fiscally healthy enough to then start looking to the future about what are we going to do to get revenue streams up and expenditures maintained as much as we can. I think that I look forward to being able to do that. I see Ms. Felice's hand.
Thank you, Madam President. So my questions involve the fund balances. And I'm looking at page number, it looks like page number 5. And yeah, let's stick with page number 5. So we're showing that a total estimated fund balance for 2021 is $9.8 million. When we are showing the previous year was about 4.2 and audited numbers in June of 2020 of 5.5. Now, I'm also looking at the 2020 budget presentation where we had a year-over-year comparison of our reserve history. And on average, it stayed at about 4.6, 4.9, and the maximum it went up to for all of our reserves was 5.2. So when we say we don't have the money, we do have the money because it seems like we overtaxed the district and overfunded the reserves to the point of we had 4.2 in reserves and now we have 9.8 in reserves. So we have too much money in our reserves. Why did it escalate that to that degree? And I still can't wrap my head around the fact that we started off this budget absent the unknown of the federal monies and the state money. But we started this budget with a $15 million budget gap. When you put together a budget last year, and to have that kind of a deficit tells me that the district overspent. And that's what I'm having trouble with. I'm having trouble with, we spoke all this year about social emotional health of our students. We spoke about the need of the classroom. Ms. Arruda raised the fact that art students are going to need more help next year in trying to regain the loss of learning from this year. And I can tell you also with one of our experiences today, we watched several classrooms who had 20 plus students in the classroom and had remote students on their Google Classroom. And were speaking to the students through the computer while they were speaking to the classroom, while they were speaking to us, and while they were operating the smart board. So all this technology was taking place at the same time that we're talking about cutting our computer techs. When I've made the argument before to the board in memo, I haven't stated this publicly, but I will right now. We turned every classroom into a computer lab. While our students aren't going directly to the computer lab, each classroom is a computer lab now. And why we have two positions, I'll start with that. Why we have two positions of computer tech assistants on the chopping block is beyond me, to the tune of $100,000 in salary, a little over $1,000. When we saw one computer lab person in one school, literally doing laps around the school while we were taking our tour today. We were on one end of the building, they were there. We were on the other end of the building, they were there. So these are the things that are going on that are troublesome to me. I wish we had a further look back of our reserves like we did in the last year's budget, but explain to me how we had an estimated fund balance of $4.2 million, and now we have, and now that ballooned to 9.8. So the money's there. What happened? That there's so much money in reserves. Did we overtax the district, or are we overfunding our fund balance? That's my first question. I have more. Can that question be answered first?
Sure. On slide 5 that you referenced in column A, I believe you're looking at the unassigned fund balance line, which is the last line, $5.5 million.
Correct.
It has to be looked at with the line above it, the assigned fund balance. So the total fund balance for the district that year is $9.5 million compared to the $9.8 million that we have estimated. The reason it's not identified on the assigned line, it's because the board hasn't yet given the authority or made the executive decision.
I understand that. I understand. And that's where you're proposing the 4 million, correct? Okay. Now I understand that. The total cumulative 9.8, when you look at last year's presentation, the reserve history year over year, the unassigned fund balance before we moved it in to the assigned fund balance was on an average of $4.5 million to $5 million. Why is it now 9.8?
I'm not looking at what you're looking at, but it's our unassigned and assigned has always been in approximately the $9 million range for the last 4 or 5 years looking back. So I'm not sure what's being looked at there.
Okay, we'll hold that question. Thank you, but we'll hold that question. All right, I mentioned about the social emotional. Our students are going to need more support next year, not less. And I thank you for the president for clarifying that we are not looking to pierce the cap, because that I was under that impression too when I saw that slide, that you had a presentation only to see what it looked like, but it certainly in this room, and I can't imagine the board would be looking to pierce the cap. We are not. The expense side, I just don't see where this budget went so out of balance for this time around. And like the question that was asked of other board members and Mr. Trent just a little while ago, the staffing cut comes to under just $1.5 million. And I just think that's going to do so much to hurt our district at a time when we need it most. We also looked at some of the questions that I presented to the district, and I also want to go on the record to say I support that we have one more special board meeting, either of a board meeting or workshop. There is a lot to unpack. I got here at 5:15 to show up in person because I think we have a commitment now that if we're bringing our students back in person, that we have to start having board meetings back in person. It has to be in a larger facility. We are socially distanced here, but we would not be in the boardroom, and we certainly wouldn't be to have the public there. And I think the public wants to be back at these meetings, but we have to. I just lost my train of thought. I apologize. Oh, in the questions that I had asked about having a special meeting, there was so I got here at 5:15. And I asked for a printed copy of the budget presentation that was going to be delivered tonight. I was handed one copy, and then I got a second copy, and then I got a third copy. That's how many times it changed from 5:15 to 6:15 when we started the meeting. Not a criticism. I understand that that's how fast you're getting the numbers and you're trying to crunch the numbers. My point is, we got the final presentation at 6:15. That's too much to unpack to make it to absorb and ask enough questions and get enough feedback, even from our community and each other, to make a decision in two weeks. I think we need one more meeting. We've had many special meetings this year, and we need one more meeting between now and then to make this decision, because like some have already said what they cannot support. I'm very disappointed that we spent so much time to renovate the South Haven Childhood Development Center. It's a model, it's pristine, and now we're looking to totally privatize it and not have any of our employees there, not have any responders. We're cutting a nurse from that program, but if we're still going to have that program at South Haven, and even though the community-based organizations will be running it solely, which is a private entity, we're taking a nurse out of there. Why do they not need a nurse? But when we run it, we need a nurse, especially in COVID times. COVID's not going away September. We're still going to have those protocols. So I'm not in support of privatizing that unit and the cuts that are planned there. And also, I'm not in support of cutting any teachers at this point when we need so much in our classroom. And I saw how they had to juggle those technological items that I mentioned earlier, and certainly can't support taking. I mean, I got here, signed up, had my computer ready to go, and suddenly what I thought had an internet connection didn't have an internet connection. So all during executive session, I couldn't read any of the documents we were referring to. I had to wait until after executive session to get our computer technology in here to assist me. And if I was home, I would have been connected. So there's a lot that we still have to do, and we haven't even talked about the state tests and coming up with a position to for or against those tests, because those numbers plague us. Our watch list in our schools, these cuts, how will it affect those schools that we're still being watched by the state? There's just so much here that we were on a steady incline in this district on improvement and items to be proud of. And this budget, I think, just takes us in the wrong direction. We got the money. I understand you want to do a 3-year plan over the stimulus money and the rescue plan money. I think that is wise. I'm willing to look at that closer, but I just don't see where we had such a budget deficit and the direction we're going in. I'm going to end my question now to give others an opportunity.
May I just ask Ms. Felice so that I understand what your point is? If the staffing, the elimination of staffing because of reduced population as opposed to the budgetary issue. This is not a case where people are being laid off because of not having money. But if those staffing positions were continued, as Ms. Costa said, we'd have to come up with about 20, with a couple of $1 million from somewhere. And are you saying that you would be willing to pierce the cap for $2 million to cover that?
No, President Hayes. Please don't put words in my mouth.
I'm asking you to clarify because because I don't hear where the source of money would be.
Oh,
I just explained where it was. I think it's in the reserves.
It is in the reserves because I'm on page 6. It shows the maximum amount of money we can pull from the reserves versus what is recommended that we pull from the reserves. So that 1.5, $1.8 million is there in the reserves that we are able to use. It's just not being recommended that we do use it. It's there.
I think that we need to inquire though about what's the recommended practice for some of these reserves, because are there any state guidances about what is necessary given the size of staff and projected retirements and so on? How does one figure out what is
Now, well, I'm
What is
glad you brought
necessary?
up retirements because have we looked at attrition? Have we looked at attrition as opposed to layoffs? And someone mentioned also earlier about retirement incentives. And while we have issues in the collective bargaining agreement, certainly there's, I don't know if the state is planning on offering a retirement incentive, but there are ways we can look at to reduce the staff if that's indeed what we have to do through attrition and not through layoffs. You really haven't shown where we have an overabundance of classrooms, an overabundance of teachers with respect to the classrooms. And the projection, and in the questions, I have 8 pages of questions and answers that we also just got the final response to earlier today. The one question I asked about the enrollment, I failed to ask the projected enrollment for 2022, 23, 24. So it stopped just, where we were right now. And I don't have those answers. That'll be a follow-up question that I'll ask. But we're only down 400 students. And if you look at that time, it was the 16-17 year. And we know what happened in 16-17. We had MS-13 and we had Frank P. Long. And a lot of people pulled their kids from our district because of Frank P. Long. And we obviously haven't gotten them back. Another issue that actually I think I raised to you, President Hayes, but I haven't raised it to the superintendent, and I thank you for reminding me about it. But we have a lot of families that had dual homes, both the city and out here in our community. And a lot of those families have now moved here permanently. Has the district reached out to those families to encourage them to go to public education and utilize our school system if they are already in private school? Has the district reached out to those families who took their students out of our district and went to public school, went to private school, to see what was missing from our district that encouraged them to do that? And what could we do to entice them to come back in? And I don't see that the district has made any movement in that direction. And I think that's something that the board should give the administration the resources and the staff to do. I think we have to do a lot more outreach with the families that are out there. I have people that live on my block that just moved in permanently now, and their children are still in private school remotely in the school that they were once in the city. So we need to do something to encourage them come September to enroll here at South Country. We show how we have a lot to offer. We show the dedication of our teachers, and I don't think we're doing enough to reverse that decline in enrollment, because I think we can.
Mr. Puccini, I saw your hand.
Yeah, thanks. I did lose my train of thought for a minute there, but so I do appreciate Dr. Gianni and Ms. Costa's efforts here to balance this. If anybody knows anything about me and the budget, I'm always cautious about pulling more money out of the reserves because save it for a rainy day, but it's obviously raining. So that's why I am in support of that, of pulling out as much as being recommended. What I do appreciate in this is the outlook, because that's always my concern, is how far down the road do we kick the can. And I would caution the board, in regards to the elimination of some positions, what Dr. Gianni said before, it's only going to be worse next year. And that's why I wouldn't be in favor of pulling out more than what's recommended to close this gap to keep staff. It's going to cost us more, and we're pulling more out when we may need, some of those funds for the next year's gap. So I think it's pretty remarkable that the gap was closed in those few short weeks. I know we got answers that we didn't have, but I think the low class sizes is a luxury that we've enjoyed for a while now, but I don't see how it's practical. And I say that saying it's not like we're going to have high class sizes. We're probably going to have more average class sizes in comparison to our neighboring districts, where we've had 14, 15 kids in some classes at K1 in the past, which is wonderful. But with declining enrollment and the lack of funds, I don't see how, especially since the administration has told us that this is more declining enrollment driven than it is revenue driven, we can really kind of go against that recommendation. So I'm fully in support of this recommendation. I appreciate the work that went into it. And I think I had another thought, but I did lose it while I was waiting. So if it comes back to me, I'll raise my hand again.
And I do want to just speak to the piece or the thought that 29.2 people are losing their jobs. Remember, when we made our budget presentation, particular to staffing, we talked about full-time equivalent positions, right? Some of these positions will be absorbed through attrition. However, I'm not gonna try to mislead the board. We don't have a lot of attrition in the areas that we need to reduce, but some will. Some positions will be combined with other positions at the secondary level where certifications allow us to, so folks won't lose their job. So I don't want the board to think that we're handing 29 people walking papers. When we look at staffing, we look at staffing in terms of full-time equivalent positions, because that's how you build a budget. And we look at the needs of the district. And that's what we have done here. And again, I just caution the board that if you put positions back, we have to find it from somewhere, because we have to reduce expenditures. And if we don't, and even if the board chose to go into reserves to put the positions back, I want to reiterate, you're going to have a big cliff next year. We're going to be in a bigger problem than we are this year. And we were fortunate to get the rescue money that we did. And I think enough said with regard to that.
So we had said at our last meeting that everybody should pencil in next Wednesday in case we needed to have a special meeting. Does the board think we need to have a special meeting next Wednesday? Or are we in a position to let administration know tonight how the board is leaning with regard to the recommendation that's been brought to us? I think maybe, yes, Ms. Felice. When you hold the paper up in your hand, it merges with the wall, and I couldn't quite tell.
I also wore blue and I'm blending in with the chair.
Okay.
I do apologize for that. And I can see it on the screen, so I know it's difficult to see us. But thank you for your patience with that. Just to answer your, I have a follow-up on some of the other questions, but to answer your question, yes, I do feel that we need another meeting. Like I said, there's a lot to unpack. I presented Ms. Costa a question with a reference to a slide that she doesn't have the advantage of seeing it right now. So I would like to give her the ability to look at that, and we can dig into that a little bit deeper. I'm certainly not trying to be obstinate here. We have a big responsibility any time it comes around with the budget, and I'm not taking it lightly. I do appreciate the effort that administration put into this. But one of the other questions that I had asked was in looking at the employee count year over year. And when you look at the administrative budget from 2016 to 17 to now, we increased the administrative staff by 2. But yet when you look at the teaching staff from last year to this year, we decreased it by 6. When you look at the teaching assistant jobs and the teacher's assistants, I mean, they were busy all the time we were in the classroom today. And I realized, you know, that was one day, it was a snapshot in time, but I can't imagine it's any different any other day. And we reduced that staff by, I can't do a quick math in my head. What is a quick math? No, it's 17 from this year to last year. And our students, admittedly, I think we all agree, have more needs. CCA was reduced by 2. And our guards and responders were reduced by, I think that's the guard. Yeah, it's the guard, bargaining unit. They were reduced by 6.
So the teacher,
Everybody else decreased.
not looking at what you have in front of you, Ms. Felice, I could tell you the teacher reductions are a direct result of enrollment. The TA reductions are more than likely also a direct result of less classes, because we have TAs support our classes. And with regard to the administrative increase, I'll just share with you, we are far below what other districts have in terms of administration. Looking at a similar school like Bayshore, who's similar in size and demographic, they have 14 directors to South Country's 7. When you look at our neighbors, you'll see the same exact thing. So while we've increased administration over the few years, it hasn't even brought us close to what our neighboring districts or what similar schools have to support our children.
And wouldn't you agree that if we can't support 7, we're certainly not going to be able to support 14? So I'll just close out by saying that yes, I do think we need another meeting.
Okay, so let me just poll the board now. Mr. Trent, do you think we need another meeting?
Yes.
Mr. Parker? Mr. Piccini?
No.
Ms. Aruda?
I think it would be fair to Ms. Costa and to the administration to give them some more time to be able to go through. And I appreciate all the work that you did today, Ms. Costa. I do understand that everything came in very last minute. And I'm sure that you were scrambling today down to the last wire. But I think that it's only fair to her to give her an additional week to be able to look at the numbers and figure out some things. And again, I appreciate all the work that you did today. And I'm sure you're exhausted.
Administration doesn't need any additional time. The recommendation is well vetted. We've discussed it since last night. Unless some new development comes forward, we don't need additional time to look at anything. I mean, I don't have any rocks to look under in terms of monies or additional funding, really, unless something changes on the part of the state providing additional money. There's nothing further to look at.
Okay, well, like I said, I know that Ms. Costa is the one that's working with the numbers right now, and I know that the numbers did come in late last night and changes were made. So I just want to give her the opportunity, since she is our numbers person, to be able to kind of look through them and give her the credit for all of the work that she has done since last night and into today.
Mr. Parker, do you want to weigh in on having another meeting or not? You're muted.
You're muted.
I did give my opinion before. I'm sorry I was muted. I don't think so. Yeah.
But I just want to add that we did just get this right before our meeting started. So, and it's very different from the last one. I don't think that, I think that I would hope everyone would want more time to review it. I reviewed it when we were getting the presentation. I had no time to review it before because we had just gotten it. So I don't see how everyone is comfortable with moving forward with the recommendations, but.
It's a recommendation.
Our next
Which
meeting
does not require us to go to the taxpayer to pierce the cap. And that's, to me, the biggest difference between what we were working with 2 weeks ago or last week, before we got the updated information from the state.
And the next meeting is when the board would adopt the budget also. Administration is looking for guidance on doing that, and that's what tonight is.
One more question. I have one more question. If, again, not suggesting that we pierce the cap, but if the district were to go in that direction, weren't we required to tell the state that long before now? Even if we were to go in that direction?
Yeah, but that could be updated.
March deadline?
That could be updated.
It's required to be filed in March, could be changed anytime after that, up until your budget vote.
Say that one more time?
You file a preliminary number by March, the deadline, and then you can change it at any time up until your budget.
Okay, thank you.
So based upon the recommendation before us right now, we don't need to be looking at piercing the cap this year. And depending on how things work out in the next several years with regard to enrollment and staffing and attrition, we may or may not need to look at piercing the cap. We are looking at anticipated budget gaps in each of the 2 following years based upon your best projections. And the budget gap's approaching about $2 million. So this will be a discussion that the board's going to have. I think that it will be a discussion that with the help of our finance professionals and our administration, we ought to get a firm grip on long-range planning, because I don't feel like that's been done. I know that my first year on the board was last year, and it was right when the pandemic hit, and we were dealing with that set of issues. But now I'm looking more down the road, and I would really like to feel that we're able to have some discussions about the long-range planning that will have this district on very good financial footing, so that we aren't in the cliff situation that's been mentioned several times already tonight. So let's see, I have 3 people who, I think I got that right, Ms. Felice, Mr. Trent, and Ms. Aruda, who think they would like another meeting, and 3 who feel that the recommendation is a responsible one. I think, given that, we're going to need to give the benefit to the people who feel that they need some time to digest it in order to come to a decision. And I would say, let's stay with our special meeting for next Wednesday. Sole issue will be to finalize and give guidance to administration about how to move forward on the budget.
Thank you, Madam President.
Well, I think it's a difficult situation for everybody. And I feel that our administration has done a remarkable job in guiding us through all of the quagmire that's been thrown at us from the state budget and the state guidances and everything. And I do want to thank you for all your hard work and what you've come up with. And assuming that there's no changes between now and next week, I will be also saying I'm comfortable in approving the recommendation that was made tonight. So let's see,
Want to set a time for that meeting?
the time, does everybody like 6:15, or would you rather have it be at 7, or what works?
I have no reason for executive session, so we can
No.
just move right into it.
Right.
I'm doubtful to even be able to make the meeting, so whatever. works for that.
I can't make next Wednesday. I have another meeting scheduled for 5:30.
Okay, Ms. Aruda, I think your schedule does not permit you to come any earlier, is that right?
I can come earlier. I can come. Yeah, I can be in by that one time I could not come earlier, but I can be in by 5 o'clock.
5 o'clock?
Mhm.
And, okay, so, and Mr. Parker, tell me again when your meeting is?
5:30.
And it, okay, so is it also virtual? So you'd have half an hour? Maybe?
So to speak, yeah.
Okay. And Mr. Pacini, you're sure about that?
As of now, I can't. If I can change things, it definitely won't be able to make it at 5 o'clock regardless. If I
Okay.
do, I can do it later, but again, I don't really, at this point, I wasn't prepared to juggle things around, so I don't think I can make it at all. If I can change things, it won't be for early. It would have to be later than 5
Like
o'clock.
what? Like what?
That-
What's
like
later?
7. Like 7.
Okay. All right. All I'm gonna say is it was very clear to me from our last meeting that we were penciling in next Wednesday. So,
Understood, but things have changed significantly for me in my personal life, so that happened this week, so there's nothing I can do about it.
okay. All right, this is where it feels like chasing cats to get things done, and if we don't have another meeting, then I've got 3 board members who wanted to have an opportunity to ask more questions.
Perhaps we can schedule time for them to meet with Ms. Costa to address their concerns.
Would that satisfy you, Ms. Felice, Mr. Trent, and Ms. Aruda?
No, it wouldn't satisfy me. I think that these conversations need to be had in front of the public. And I would also just remind the board that policy 1520 allows any trustee to call a special meeting. So you don't necessarily need the approval of the majority.
No, but you have to have
Yeah,
a
but
quorum.
you have to have a quorum, Mr. Trent, and if people can't come, then
You don't have to have,
there's no point.
you don't have to have all the board members present though.
Pardon me?
You don't have to have all the board members
You
present.
have to have a quorum.
That's a forum. It's not all of them.
And so what we have right now is not knowing from Ms. Ancona, because she's not here, what her availability is. And I can't do this arithmetic right now in my head, but we would need a quorum, and then we would need a majority of the board to vote to either.
We wouldn't be voting that night, but I mean, we came into this meeting, I came into this meeting, I'm not gonna speak for anybody else, fully believing we were having another meeting, and okay, the state budget came down, but it came down late last night. To be expected to digest all of this when there are still outstanding questions. We already said we were gonna have a special meeting on the 14th. So I don't know what changed. So I'm sorry that we can't move in that direction. But
Mr. Parker,
we were
the meeting that you have next Wednesday, would you expect to be finished by 7?
Oh, absolutely.
So if we schedule it for 7, then you'd be available. Miss Aruda would be available. Mr. Pacini might be able to make arrangements.
And I think that's a reasonable compromise since the superintendent already indicated there'd be no need for executive session. The 7 o'clock start would be earlier than we even started tonight. But
Right.
I agree with Mr. Trent. These questions and discussions have to be asked and answered in public. And I would also encourage the district to do everything that it possibly could to have the April 21st meeting where we will vote on adopting the budget, to have that in person.
I think that's a different discussion, Ms. Felice, because I've had input from the community where they actually say they can hear us better in this format. And if we go into a larger venue than the boardroom, it makes it hard for us to have discussions among ourselves. We're sitting up on a stage. I just think these are things to consider, and I don't think that that ought to be diverting us from what we need to do with regard to getting this budget moving forward.
I can absolutely agree with you there. And I've gotten that feedback too, that they can see us better, they can hear us better. Tonight is a little awkward for me. I wanted to try to do the right thing and be in person, but it is awkward, and I understand that. But then I think the district has to do a little bit better about our streaming capability, so that the public can see us better and can hear us better. I realize that's not going to be done by the 21st, but I think we have to do something a little bit better to improve the quality of our streaming service.
But the feedback I'm getting is that by doing the Zoom meetings, that's exactly what's been accomplished. It's been the YouTube presentation that's been difficult.
But we're denying the public a chance to come before us. That's the piece that's missing.
I'm sorry?
We're denying the public a chance to come before us. So if we can get that piece rectified, then I think it's a win-win.
Well, by having the written emails like we've been doing, and I think that we could certainly talk about, maybe some other ways if people I'd be willing to talk to the administration or the tech people about whether it can be done verbally or not. But even some of the people who said, well, we don't get to come and talk to you. And I've pointed out that, yes, it's an opportunity for you to talk to us, but it's not an opportunity for a discussion with us. And so, if you either can present verbally or present in writing. And so far, the doing it in writing seems to satisfy the ones who wanted to make the comments. So anyway, like I said, it's something for further discussion. And as we learn more from the technology that we've been working with, we can try to make things better. So right now, we're going to have the special meeting next Wednesday at 7 o'clock. And I'll have Miss Flynn tomorrow. If she's available, I'll talk to you about getting the notice out. Okay. All right. And just for the record, there was no communication sent to us, so there wasn't any public commentary for tonight's meeting. Next is the meeting. Any closing remarks? And if not, the motion to adjourn.
I just have two quick remarks. The road, I believe it's Patchogue Avenue, the road that's directly in front of Frank P. Long. Can you confirm that's the name of the road? It's very, very in disrepair. So I'd like the district to write a letter to the town requesting the pothole repairs for that school. I mean, it was very bad coming right out of the driveway where the buses come. So I would just like to make that notation and ask and request the district make a request to have it repaired. And also the Mr. Conquest sign on the field behind the middle school in operation today. It was taken down in September because it was in disrepair. It hasn't been replaced. we get an update at the next meeting as to the status of that sign. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So now is there a motion to adjourn? Mr. Trent, Ms. Aruda, second. All in favor? I see that Mr. Pacini's left the meeting. So the 5 of us remaining are all in agreement that the meeting is now adjourned. Thank you all.